Chapter 11. Mr. Cranky's Great Idea, from George's Marvellous Medicine by Roald Dahl. Mr. Cranky's Great Idea. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of great excitement, even more than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it." "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before. There had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," Mr. Killy Cranky said, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then it will sell it to every farmer in the world, so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvellous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We will become rich, and you will become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It's going to change the world." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said again. "Don't keep saying wait a minute," said Mr. Cranky. "There isn't 1 minute to wait. We must get cracking at once." "Do calm down, my dear," Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, "and do stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes." "The heck with my cornflakes," said Mr. Cranky, leaping from his chair. "Come along, George. Let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is make one more saucepanful as a tester." "But, Dad," said little George, "the trouble is—" "There won't be any trouble, my boy. How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into the saucepan as you did yesterday. And while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe." "But, Dad," George said, "please listen to me." "Why don't you listen to him, dear?" Mrs. Cranky said. "The boy's trying to sell you something." Mr. Cranky was far too excited to listen to anyone except himself. "And then," he cried, "when the new mixture's ready, we'll test it out on an old hen just to make absolutely sure we've got it right. And after that, we'll all shout hurrah and build a giant factory." "But, Dad—" "Come on then, what is it you want to say?" "I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put in the saucepan to make the medicine," George said. "Of course you can, my dear boy," cried Mr. Cranky. "I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get there in the end. You see if you don't. Now then, what was the very first thing you put in?" "Well, I went up to the bathroom first," George said. "I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table." "Come on then," said Mr. Killy Cranky. "Up we go to the bathroom." When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosols and empty bottles. "That's good," said Mr. Cranky. "That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it." So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. "A box of powder," said Mr. Cranky. "Helga's hair set. Flowers of turnips perfume. Terrific! This is going to be easy. Where did you go next?" "To the laundry room," George said. "But are you sure we haven't missed anything up here, Dad?" "That's up to you, my boy. Have I?" "I don't think so," George said. So down they went to the laundry room, and once again Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. "My goodness me, what a mass of stuff you've used. No wonder it did magical things. Is this the lot?" he asked. No, Dad, it's not," George said, and led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept, and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. "Anything else?" he asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, and thought, but he couldn't remember putting anything else in. Mr. Killiecranky leapt into his car and drove to the village and brought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on the list. He then went out to the vet and got a fresh supply of animal medicines George had used. "Now, show me how you did it, George," he said. "Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them together." Marvellous medicine number 2. They were in the kitchen now, and the big saucepan was on the stove. All the things that Mr. Cranky had bought were lined up near the sink. "Come along, my boy," Mr. Killiecranky said. "Which one did you put in first?" "This one," George said. "Golden Gloss hair shampoo," and he emptied the bottle into the pan. "Now the toothpaste," George went on, "and the shaving soap, and the face cream, and the nail varnish." "Keep at it, my boy," said Mr. Cranky, dancing around the kitchen. "Keep putting them in. Don't stop, don't pause, don't hesitate. It's a pleasure, my dear fellow, to watch you work." One by one, George poured and squeezed all the things into the saucepan. With everything so close at hand, the job didn't take him more than 10 minutes. But when it was all done, the saucepan somehow didn't seem quite as full as it had the last time. "Now what did you do?" said Mr. Cranky. "Did you stir it up?" "I boiled it," George said, "but not for long, and I stirred it as well." So Mr. Cranky lit the gas under the saucepan, and George stirred the mixture with the same long wooden spoon he'd used before. "It's not brown enough," George said. "Wait a minute, I know what I've forgotten." "What?" said Mr. Cranky. "Tell me, quick, because if we've forgotten even one tiny little thing, then it won't work. At least, not in the same way." "A quart of brown gloss paint," George said. "That's what I've forgotten." Mr. Killiecranky shot out of the house and into his car like a rocket. He sped down to the village and bought the paint and rushed back again. He opened the can in the kitchen and handed it to George. George poured the paint into the saucepan. "Ah, that's better," George said. "That's more like the right colour." "It's boiling," said Mr. Cranky. "It's boiling and bubbling. George, is it ready yet?" "It's ready," George said. "Or at least, I hope it is." "Righto," said Mr. Cranky, hopping about. "Let's test it. Let's give it to a chicken." "But heavens alive, why don't you calm down a little?" Mrs. Cranky said, coming in from the kitchen. "Calm down? You expect me to calm down? And here we are, mixing up the greatest medicine ever discovered in the history of the world. Come along, George. Dip a cupful out of the saucepan. Get a spoon, and we'll give some to a jolly old chicken just to make absolutely certain we've got the correct mixture." Outside in the yard there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's marvellous medicine number 1. They were pecking about in the dirt in that silly way that chickens do. George crouched down, holding out a spoonful of marvellous medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. He walked up to the spoon and went peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on this chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was certainly interesting. "Whoosh!" shrieked the chicken, and it shot 6 feet up in the air and came down again. Then sparks began flying out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as if someone was sharpening a knife on the grindstone inside his tummy. Then his legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer, and then longer still. "What's happening to it?" said Mr. Killiecranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd, with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched high up on the top. It was a bit like a chicken on stilts. "Oh, my sainted aunts!" said Mr. Killiecranky. "We've got it wrong. This chicken's no use to anybody. It's all legs. No one wants chicken's legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you left something out," said Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What is it that you've left out?" "I've got it," said George. "What was it? Quick!" "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer."
"Wait a minute," said George. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?"
"We did not," said Mr. Cranky.
"I used that too."
Well, no wonder it went wrong, said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish.